Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Okay, good evening, everyone. Okay, everyone should have gotten a handout which represents, called the basic pattern of the Mulapariyaya Sutta in one page. Okay, so we've been studying the Mulapariyaya Sutta, the discourse on the root of all things, which is Sutta number 1 in the Majjhima Nikaya. And last week I went through the first section of the sutta, which explains, or in which the Buddha expounds what we call this basic cognitive pattern of the ordinary person, the untaught or the ignorant ordinary person, in regard to the first of the 24 bases of conceiving, which is the earth element, or earth. And just to sort of summarize or review, maybe taking it from a little slightly different angle. Okay, this is what is occurring before the pattern explained in the Mulapariyaya occurs. In the mind of the uninstructed worldling, there's already this ignorance and the other underlying tendencies, the latent tendencies, the dormant defilements. Okay, so when the ordinary person, the worldling, comes into contact with objects in the world, this is called contact. That is, one makes contact through the senses with different sensory objects, forms, sounds, smells, tastes, tactile objects, and other phenomena. And through this contact there arises a perception of these phenomena. And this perception is what I would call a primary perception. Okay, now, because of this ignorance, the worldling, or the ordinary person, instead of going on from this perception to understand and correctly grasp the nature of the phenomena impinging on the senses, the worldling simply perceives the sensory phenomena in a somewhat distorted way. He grasps them as being concrete, substantial realities. And this is what the Mulapariyaya Sutta speaks of as perceiving earth as earth. This is not what we would call an insight experience of the earth element as the earth element. This is not what results from contemplating the earth element simply as the earth element. But when the worldling perceives, or the ordinary person perceives, some solid, substantial object, he'll just grasp it through perception as a solid, substantial object and take it as a whole instead of seeing into it as being a compound of impermanent elements. Okay, and then based upon this distorted perception, this perception that is already slightly misrepresenting the object, the worldling, the ordinary person, then starts to think about the object. And this thinking about the object is also distorted or misrepresentational. It misrepresents the object. He thinks about the object in ways that distort or misrepresent the nature of the object. And this type of erroneous thinking of the object is what is called in the Mulapariyaya Sutta Majjhima, conceiving. So that the worldling, the ordinary person, conceives the object, conceives the earth element. And what is meant by conceiving is thinking that establishes some relationship between oneself, understood as being some kind of subject, some kind of truly existing entity, and the object as something which is present to that perceiving subject. And according to the way the commentaries explain conceiving of Majjhima, it's thinking which is motivated by, or thinking which is governed by, three basic defilements: craving, conceit, and wrong views. So through the influence of craving, conceiving manifests as thinking in terms of what is mine or what might be mine, thinking in terms of whether things are pleasant, beautiful, delightful, desirable. Through the influence of conceit, mana, conceiving means thinking that centers around the idea I am, and then it leads into thoughts, thinking which is governed by comparisons. Am I better? Am I worse? Am I just as good as the others? And then conceiving, which is governed by views, is conceiving the object in a way which involves positing some kind of real self, a truly existing self, a permanent, lasting, one view is a permanent, lasting self, or else a self which is just temporary, a self which exists for a short time during the course of a life, and then comes to an end at the end of the life. There's a handout. Take another one for the back, a few for the back. Actually, they should all be brought to the back, so if other people come late, they could just pick them up. From this perception, okay, so conceiving is this kind of, we call it deluded thinking, distorted thinking, thinking which misrepresents the nature of the object. And then the way this conceiving is elaborated in the Mulapariyaya Sutta, the Buddha explains that the uninstructed, the untaught ordinary person might conceive in relation to the object in different ways. The Buddha uses different grammatical forms. He says that he might conceive. The first is simply he conceives the earth. Then he conceives in earth. He conceives from earth. Last week I gave examples of different ways this might be understood in relation to the three types of conceiving, in relation to craving, conceit, and views. And then there comes, you could say, a strong type of conceiving governed by craving, which is the idea he conceives earth to be mine. This is where conceiving is definitely governed by craving, because one wants to get possession of some object that is regarded as the earth element. And then the last statement sheds a different light on this situation. Instead of taking it in terms of cognition, the way one thinks about the object, one now takes it from the standpoint of how one relates to the object emotionally. And here the statement is made, he delights in earth. That is, one finds pleasure and enjoyment in the object. And this verb used here, abhinandati, is also the word which is used in the description of craving in the second noble truth. It said that craving, tatra tatra abhinandani, craving is what delights here and there. So this connects the statement, that word connects the statement, this explanation of the worldling's thought process. It connects it to the teaching of the Four Noble Truths. And so it connects this whole statement about the way the ordinary person thinks. It connects it to the second Noble Truth, showing that this is a kind of alternative way of explicating the truth of the origin of suffering. And then the Buddha raises the question, why is this? Why is it that the ordinary person thinks in this way, and why is it that he delights in the earth element? And then the Buddha gives the answer himself, and he says, because he has not fully understood it. And the word that's translated here as fully understood is well, it's given in the negative, apariññātaṃ. Apariññātaṃ means lack of pariññā. Pariññā means full understanding, full comprehension. And full comprehension, full understanding, if one goes back and looks at the first discourse of the Buddha, the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, one sees that the Buddha assigns a particular task to each of the Four Noble Truths. And the task regarding the first noble truth, the noble truth of suffering, is pariññā. The first noble truth, the Buddha says, is to be fully understood. Pariññāyaṃ. The first noble truth is pariññāyaṃ, to be fully understood. And lack of full understanding can be seen as an aspect of ignorance. And so it's because of this lack of full understanding, because of this ignorance, that when the worldling, the ordinary person, perceives any object, that perception will trigger off this diluted conceptual process, cognitive process. Instead of moving from the perception to a clear understanding of the object, the perception will go to this distorted perception, perceiving X as X, then conceiving X, conceiving in X, conceiving from X, conceiving X is mine. And then accompanying this, there will be this emotive, what I call the emotive response. He will delight in X, become attached to it. Okay, now I'll ask if there's any questions on this review of the basic pattern. I know this is not an easy subject to understand. Yes?
The five aggregates of feeling follows contact.
In the five aggregate scheme, contact is not explicitly mentioned. Okay, the question is...
Well, here, feeling follows perception, or conceiving.
In this scheme, feeling is not actually mentioned. It's not explicitly mentioned.
I assume that's what delight's with.
Delight is not actually feeling. Delight is a kind of aspect of, let's say it's an aspect of craving. It's the aspect of craving by which one enjoys the object. So there is feeling mixed in with that delight. But the expression delight signifies more the activity of craving, when with craving one seeks the enjoyment in the object, or looks for enjoyment in the object. But the five aggregate scheme is not being used explicitly in this sutta. Yes?
The perceiving of X as X.
Yeah.
Secondary cognition. I guess that's below the level of conscious awareness.
Okay, the question is whether this perceiving X as X is below the level of conscious awareness. Now, strictly, according to Buddhism, there's no act of cognition, no perception which is really below the level of conscious awareness. Since consciousness is accompanying every act of perception, and consciousness is accompanying this perception too. There is consciousness going along with that perception. And yeah, that would be quite a conscious perception.
It just happens quickly.
It happens quite quickly, but I would say also we could see it happening in our own experience, just the way we ordinarily experience the world is through this type of perception, that we ordinarily perceive things in a very gross way, but we're not aware of how our mind is synthesizing perceptions, which are, you see, the original perceptions are occurring, the primary cognitions are occurring very quickly, but we're not able to attend to them so quickly and to see how they're just arising and passing. And so because of that, they get fused or synthesized in our experience into a gross perception. And then we grasp on that gross perception and we take it to be revealing a world of solid and substantial objects. But it's through mindfulness applied to the stream of experience, moment after moment after moment, that one becomes able to discern the distinct occasions of perception. And then one sees how individual perceptions arise, pass away very, very quickly. And then one could see how these distinct individual perceptions are fused together to make these gross perceptions.
I guess in the case of familiar objects, it's harder to see, but if you come across a novel object, maybe the perceiving of X as X would be more apparent to you before you have any conceptual framework to lay onto it.
That's a good way to make that point clear. When one perceives an object for the first time, an object with which one is not previously acquainted, then one has to figure out what it is, and so one initially has no perception of it as a particular thing. And so now one is working with a number of individual perceptions, perceiving one after another, and then eventually one groups these different perceptions together until one has one identifying a label to apply to the object. Then when one perceives it on subsequent occasions, then one will simply perceive it as such and such. One uses the general concept to identify the object.
Bhante, does this presume that the primary cognition is through any of the faculties, any individual faculty that causes a perception? Not just sight or taste?
Yeah, the primary perception can be through any sense faculty. But I think here, what I would say here, probably we should understand that the primary perception, primary cognition, in all of these cases will be mental cognition. Some of the later ones would apply to sensory perceptions, as we'll see as we go through the list. I'm going to go through the list. But many of the different types of beings, the classes of beings, would require a mental perception rather than a sensory perception. Okay, I think we should go on. Okay, now I want to go through the different bases of conceiving. Here we have a list of 24, we call them bases of conceiving, which fall into certain distinct groups. Okay, the first four are the four primary elements. You have earth, water, fire, and air. Okay, next we have the word beings. He perceives beings as beings. And now the word that's used here, the Pali word is bhuta, which can have various meanings. And so the commentary has to distinguish what kind of meaning the word bhuta has in this case. Sometimes the word bhuta can mean anything at all that has existence, even an inanimate object, anything that is common to being, anything that exists can be called bhuta. And sometimes it can refer to all living beings, all sentient beings. So it's identical with the word satta, all sentient beings. But we'll see as the text goes on that the sutta will mention other types of sentient beings, particularly different types of devas or gods. And so the commentary says that here the word beings is referring to sentient beings, but only with a limited reference. That is, it refers to all sentient beings below the level of the devas or gods. But it doesn't include the gods, because the gods are mentioned separately. And so it will include human beings, animals, the spirits, hell beings, if one perceives them. Okay, after this comes the devas. These are the gods. And according to the commentary, since the gods from the higher worlds will again be mentioned separately, so the commentary says that these are the gods of the 6 sense-sphere heavenly worlds. Then we come in paragraph 9 to Pajapati. Now, here I don't agree with the commentary. The commentary says, you see, the word Pajapati means literally Lord of creation, Lord of creatures. And so the commentary says, who is the Lord of creation, the Lord of creatures? It's Mara. Mara is, in Buddhism, Mara is like the devil. And so since Mara is considered to be the one who controls all of the world, all of the sentient existence, all of the beings in the sense sphere, Mara is said to be the Lord of creation. But I don't think that this is really acceptable. If the Buddha wanted to speak about Mara, he would have used Mara's name. I think the text here is just using the name Pajapati, because Pajapati was one of the gods from the Vedas, from the Vedic period. It was one of the gods who was considered to be the gods of creation. And so it seems to me that this text, from certain angles, there was a text which was constructed with reference to the Brahmins in order to address concerns of the Brahmins, almost to answer almost as a kind of rejoinder to certain ideas of the Brahmins. And the way some of these phrases are constructed, especially the passage on conceiving earth, conceiving in earth, conceiving from earth, that passage seems to be echoing certain lines from, I think it's the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, which speaks about the Atman, as that is the self, as being the one who is in the earth but is not of the earth, the one who is the controller and ruler of the earth. That is yourself, the universal one, the all-embracing one. Okay, so if my hypothesis is correct, then it seems that this text is picking up this God Pajapati again because it's mirroring the type of language that was being used by the Brahmins, and offering almost a kind of answer, or the Buddhist answer, to a viewpoint of the Brahmins. I'll have to check to see if we have the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad here, and I'll see if I can find that passage. In fact, I think I quoted that. Yeah, I did quote that in the introduction to this. He who inhabits the earth, yet is within the earth, whom the earth does not know, whose body the earth is, and who controls the earth from within, he is yourself, the inner controller, the immortal. And then the same statement is made in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad with regard to water, fire, the sky, air, heaven, the sun, the quarters, that's the directions, the moon, the stars, space, darkness, light, beings, breath, speech, eye, ear, mind, skin, intellect, and the organs of generation. And so there's a kind of, we say almost a kind of echoing of the language of the Upanishads in the sutta. Okay, next comes Brahma. So Brahma was the supreme deity worshipped by the Brahmins. Okay, and so we can see that this is directly addressed to the Brahmins. Then after this comes the gods of streaming radiance. Now this is a class of deities which might be particular to the Buddhist worldview. Though it's also possible that the Buddha took over this class of deities from other schools of thought in India during his period. But now the next few sections will take us to some aspect of Buddhist cosmology. Now, the Buddha has divided the fine material realm, or the form realm, into 4 different layers, which are said to correspond to the 4 jhanas. each of these 4 layers of the form realm, these 4 primary layers, has several subdivisions, but for each one, the Buddha takes one of these subdivisions as being the acme or peak within that particular layer. And here in the sutta, he mentions one class of gods, which is considered the peak or highest level of the gods within that layer of the form realm that corresponds to a particular jhana. So those who master the first jhana tend to take rebirth in the lowest level of the form realm. And then the high deities of that level are the Brahma deities. That's why this world is called the Brahmaloka, the world of Brahma. Then the level above that is the level for rebirth of those who master the second jhana. And the highest sphere of rebirth for these deities is the realm of the gods of streaming radiance, the Abhasara Devas. Then the level above them is the level for rebirth for those who master the third jhana. And in that realm, the highest level of rebirth is that of the gods of refulgent glory, the Subhakhina Devas. And then above that is the level for rebirth of those who master the fourth jhana. And the highest level, or the highest layer for those who master the fourth jhana are the gods of great fruit. These are called the Vehapala Devas. And so those are all mentioned in sequence here in the sutta. Okay, then in paragraph 14, we have something called Abhibhu, which means the overlord. The commentary identifies this not very convincingly as a class of beings called the unconscious beings or the non-sentient beings. I don't really find this believable. But I think Abhibhu was another name that the Brahmins used to designate the highest deity. Of course, we find in some suttas, Mahabrahma, the great Brahma deity, refers to himself as Abhibhu, which means the Lord, the Overlord, the Supreme Deity. And so I think the Buddha here is just taking another name for the Supreme Deity and using that as a term of elaboration. Okay, the next 4 sections take the 4 formless bases: the base of infinite space, the base of infinite consciousness, the base of nothingness, and the base of neither perception nor non-perception. Because it can happen that an untaught, what's called the untaught ordinary person or the uninstructed worldling, can be very skilled in meditation and could attain these deep states of samadhi and reach these stages of deep concentration. And when he gets into these states of concentration, he'll misinterpret these experiences and can take them to be in some way to be disclosures of an infinite self, a universal self, or start speculating about the relationship of himself to these deep experiences. Okay, so this takes us through 16, 17, 18. Then the next 4 sections give us 4 ways of categorizing all sensory phenomena. Okay, now we're taking the totality of sense phenomena and simply classifying them according to this 4-fold scheme. Anything experienced is either seen, heard, and then the third is sensed. And this includes anything that's sensed through the other 3 physical senses, what is smelled, tasted, or touched. And then the 4th is anything that is cognized, that is, anything that is known through the mind, through the intellect. And so any of these objects, again, the uninstructed worldling will perceive, then having perceived it, he'll conceive it and then misconceive it in various ways. Okay, the next 2, 23 and 24, take the totality of phenomena and then divide them into 2 ways they can be approached. One is as unity, the other is as diversity. This can be seen as, in fact, the way the commentary explains this, as corresponding to the experience of 2 types of people. 23 corresponds to the experience of the meditator who achieves deep samadhi. And so this meditator has an experience, access to experiences of deep unification. And so when this meditator enters into these experiences of deep unity and oneness, then he'll start speculating about these experiences of oneness and unity. Everything is one, all is unity, I am one with everything, or I am one thing and everything else is apart from me. Okay, and then 24 is diversity or multiplicity. This would correspond to the experience of one who doesn't get access to these deep experiences of samadhi. We could see these 2 as also corresponding to the philosophical views, opposed philosophical views of 23 can be monism, the idea that everything is one, or non-dualism, there's no duality. And 24 corresponds to the philosophy of pluralism, that ultimately everything is, that what is ultimately real is a diversity of multiple elements which just come together temporarily and then come apart, a kind of philosophical atomism. And then the last one, he perceives all as all. This you could say, is a totalistic experience, corresponds to a totalistic experience. This might, you could say, correspond to the views of those who hold that everything is the self, I am one with everything. Or else somebody who holds that myself is separate from all, but I am within everything, or I have emerged from the all. There are different ways to formulate these views. Okay, now the last one is somewhat puzzling, or it might be somewhat puzzling. It says that here that the uninstructed worldly person perceives Nibbana as Nibbana. Having perceived Nibbana as Nibbana, he conceives Nibbana, he conceives in Nibbana, he conceives from Nibbana, he conceives Nibbana to be mine, he delights in Nibbana. Why is that? Because he has not fully understood it, I say. Okay, this might be, I have to say, somewhat puzzling, because a worldling or an uninstructed ordinary person, by definition, doesn't have a direct perception of Nibbana and can't have a direct perception of Nibbana. If he had a direct perception of Nibbana, he wouldn't be an ordinary person. He would be an enlightened one. At least he would reach the first stage of enlightenment. He would become a stream enterer. So there's a question, how do we understand this? The commentary gives an explanation I don't find fully satisfactory. It says that this isn't the Buddhist explanation of understanding of Nibbana, but this is the understanding of Nibbana held by some of the non-Buddhist philosophers. Like there were some sects contemporary with the Buddha who held that the indulgence in sense pleasures to the ultimate without any restraint, that is Nibbana here and now. Others held attainment of the first jhana, second jhana, and so on. That is Nibbana. But I don't really know whether this is completely convincing. The way I would understand it is that a worldling can't have a direct perception of Nibbana, but the worldling could still have listened to discourses on Nibbana, about the Buddhist Nibbana, have read about Nibbana, heard discussions about Nibbana, and forms ideas about Nibbana. And then the worldling will form ideas and interpretations of Nibbana. And because the worldling still has this clinging to the idea of self, the worldling will tend to formulate this conception of Nibbana around the idea of self, or will tend to posit some relationship between Nibbana and the idea of I, or interpret Nibbana through the prism of the idea of I. Or also this uninstructed worldling might have an experience that he'll misinterpret to be an experience of Nibbana. Sometimes they might have just deep meditative experiences or psychedelic experiences which they'll take to be realizations of Nibbana, and then they will take this to be attainments of Nibbana, and then they'll misconceive it. Anyway, that is the way I would understand it. Okay, this takes us through all the 24 bases of conceiving. Now I'll ask whether there's any questions. Yeah, Tom?
It seems like in paragraph 23, there's also some sort of Buddhist philosophies in the concept of unity, maybe?
In paragraph 23, whether there's some kind of Buddhist philosophies that posit the idea of unity?
Yeah, is that possible? That the person is just also putting some kind of false conception into the Buddhist philosophy of unity, too? Or is there no Buddhist philosophy?
I have to say that there are some later Buddhist philosophies which do tend to develop ideas that sound very much like a kind of unity, positing a unity.
But just the fact that that the worldling is still putting, formulating some wrong conception about it.
The fault enters through forming these conceivings about the experience, what we call the conceivings of unity. Now, there's certainly an experience of unity, which is what is gained through the meditative attainments. This is what is achieved in samadhi or the samapattis, the meditative attainments. Those are experiences where the mind becomes deeply unified on the object so that discursive thinking stops and the mind becomes one-pointed, and it seems like an experience of merging with the object, and it seems that all diversity, all plurality has stopped. And so that can be misconceived, misconstrued as a realization of the truth about things, that ultimately reality is one. Reality is the unity of everything, and that plurality, diversity is just mere appearance. And so if one just enters into the meditative attainment and experiences as such without imposing an interpretation upon it, without taking this to be a revelation that everything is ultimately one or unity, then it's not a misconception. The conceiving or misconception comes in when one takes the meditative experience to be a revelation or disclosure of unity as some kind of ultimate reality. George, did you have a question? Yes, Janet.
In paragraph, one about Nibbana, paragraph 26, could the perceiving of Nibbana as Nibbana, could that come about from actually just seeing somebody who hasn't seen Nibbana and then developing concepts based on what they are seeing? I'm thinking of the experience that a person has who walks into the presence of the Buddha and is overwhelmed by all of the sensory input of seeing somebody who has seen.
Okay, the question is whether somebody could have this perceiving Nibbana as Nibbana by coming into the presence of a person who's attained Nibbana, and on that basis forming ideas about Nibbana.
Right, an uninstructed worldling.
The uninstructed worldling. I have to say that the wording of the text doesn't suggest that.
I was thinking back to what your comment was about how the contact is, you were speaking of it mostly in terms of a mental contact with the mental sense base, not with the physical sense base. It would seem, if I was to draw that conclusion, I would have to take it outside of the mental into more of a physical sense base, to actually have contact through sight or taste or that, more sight.
Just if I take the word of the text itself, it seems to be saying that, in this case, that the worldling actually perceives Nibbana and then perceives it as Nibbana. So it doesn't seem to be saying that he's perceiving a person, but seeing Nibbana itself. The way the commentary explains, it identifies that Nibbana as what is called the 5 kinds of Nibbana here and now, which are mentioned in the Brahmajala Sutta. This is Nibbana as the joy that comes from sensual enjoyment and the pleasure of the 4 jhanas. Then it says that one conceives this Nibbana with the conceiving of craving when one enjoys the pleasure, and one conceives it with conceit when, because of this Nibbana, one thinks, I have attained Nibbana. And then when one conceives this Nibbana to be permanent and unchanging and so on, then one conceives this Nibbana through the conceiving of views. Then if one takes oneself to be other than Nibbana, but to be existing in this Nibbana, then one conceives oneself in Nibbana. But if one conceives oneself to be apart from Nibbana, taking oneself to be other than Nibbana, thinking this is Nibbana, this is the self of mine comes from Nibbana and is other than Nibbana, then one conceives oneself apart from Nibbana. That is the conceiving of views. To understand the sutta in detail, this is quite useful. I don't mind advertising something that I did myself. But it's very useful, a little booklet, only less than 100 pages. It's not even only about 80 pages, but it's quite useful. It has the Mulapariyaya Sutta with its commentary and selections from the sub-commentary. Yes?
Bhante, perception includes both introspection and ordinary sense perception.
Yeah.
So, in thinking about the perception of singleness and the idea that this may be a reference to the experience of samadhi, if the worldling then, if they experience samadhi and then begin to conceive of it as something, is that sort of the origin of the what the Buddha would call the falseness of the Hindu idea about Atman, say, that somehow in samadhi one has this experience of oneness, and then the false views begin to arise, and then you have a theory about there being some ultimate self. Is that sort of the history of that, the development of that idea? Whereas somebody who is on the path of enlightenment, as the diagram indicates, no longer lays concepts on that.
Yeah. Okay, the question is whether, if I understand, whether the Buddha is ascribing the origin of the Hindu, or let's say the Brahmanic idea of self, to experiences or misinterpretations of samadhi, experiences of samadhi. Is that what? I'm trying to think whether the texts ascribe it just uniformly ascribe it to experiences of samadhi. I think the texts ascribe it both to experiences of samadhi and to erroneous reasoning. But definitely they see misinterpretations of samadhi to be a major contributing factor to the arising of views of self.
And again, I know you're going to get to this next week, but beyond the worldling, there's, according to the diagram, there's no longer the conceptualization of that perception, and that's perhaps the route away from the false view. Maybe you want to take it up next week.
Of course, there will be also correct conceptualization of a perception, but the text is not going to deal with the correct conceptualization of perception, but we'll come to it next week. So, okay, I think we have to stop for the evening. Okay, so we'll end with the sharing of the merits. Then next week I will conclude the sutta next week, dealing with the disciple and higher training, the Arahant and the Tathagata. Akasata chabhumata deva naga mahitika punyantang anumoditva chirang rakantu sasanang. Akasata chabhumata deva naga mahitika punyantang anumoditva chirang rakantu desanang. Akasata chabhumata deva naga mahitika punyantang anumoditva chirang rakantu mang parang. Etavata cha amhehi sampadang punya sampadang sabbe deva anumodantu sabba sampati siddhya. Etavata cha amhehi sampadang punya sampadang sabbe buddha anumodantu sabba sampati siddhya. Etavata